October 27, 2009. The air, crisp with the promise of early winter, bit at the exposed skin of Elias Thorne. He wasn't a hunter, not in the traditional sense, but a collector of forgotten stories, a cartographer of the past. Today, his compass pointed not to game trails, but to the faint, almost imperceptible scar left by a logging road long abandoned, deep within the Allegheny National Forest. His purpose, a morbid curiosity, was to retrace the steps of a local legend, a tragedy whispered around campfires, the vanishing of Ranger Michael O'Connell. 15 years had etched the story into the very bedrock of these woods, transforming it from a mere disappearance into a spectral presence. The forest, a vast indifferent entity, held its secrets close, but sometimes, just sometimes, it yielded a fragment, a bone, a rusted artifact that could pry open the lid of the past. Elias, with his worn leather gloves and keen eyes, was always looking for those fragments. He paused, consulting a laminated topo map, the lines a spiderweb of contours and elevations. The exact location he sought was marked with a red X, an arbitrary point of fascination gleaned from old newspaper clippings, a supposed last sighting, an unsubstantiated rumor of a discarded boot. The forest canopy, a patchwork of fading golds and muted browns, filtered the weak autumn sun into dappled shadows that danced with every whisper of wind. It was quiet, too quiet. The kind of silence that amplifies the rustle of leaves underfoot, the thumping of one's own heart, and the distant, almost imagined call of a hawk. He wasn't afraid, not precisely, but a profound sense of unease settled upon him, a premonition that something dormant was about to stir. The narrative of Michael O'Connell began not with a vanishing, but with an assumption of routine. May 14th, 1994. The sun, a rare and benevolent presence that spring, warmed the valleys of the Allegheny. O'Connell, a man carved from the very resilience of the forest he protected, had reported for duty at 7 a.m., his usual punctuality a testament to his character. His last recorded communication was at 8:19 a.m., a terse radio check-in confirming his patrol route, the eastern sector near a series of old-growth hemlocks. No distress, no unusual observations, just the mundane confirmation of a day's work beginning. He was, by all accounts, an expert victim, highly capable, meticulously prepared. His ranger vehicle, a sturdy olive-drab Ford Bronco, was found later that evening, parked precisely where he always left it, at the trailhead leading to the old growth. Its doors were locked. His duty bag, meticulously organized with a first aid kit, a compass, and emergency rations, lay untouched on the passenger seat. Everything in its place except the man himself. The irony was palpable. The man whose life was dedicated to safeguarding others in the wilderness, who knew every rock and root, every shift in weather, every whisper of animal life, had simply ceased to be. His expertise, his preparation, his profound connection to the very terrain he policed, offered no explanation, no shield against the void that swallowed him. The initial search was swift, thorough, and ultimately fruitless. Search and rescue teams, dogs, helicopters, thermal imaging, all deployed, all returning with the same grim report. No signal, no trace, just silence. The mountains don't explain why. Elias continued his methodical sweep, his eyes trained on the ground, searching for anything anomalous. A glint of metal, a misplaced stone, a disturbance in the ancient layer of leaf litter. He imagined O'Connell, younger then, striding through these same woods, his uniform crisp, his gaze vigilant. The forest was an archive, each fallen branch, each exposed root, a silent testament to countless seasons. He reached the coordinates marked on his map, a small, unremarkable clearing overshadowed by towering hemlocks. The ground here was uneven, littered with decaying logs and the skeletal remains of long-dead saplings. It was exactly the kind of place one might take a brief respite, or perhaps precisely the kind of place one might vanish without a trace. The air grew colder here, the sunlight struggling to penetrate the thick canopy. He remembered the newspaper articles, the frantic appeals from O'Connell's wife, Sarah. He wouldn't just leave, she had insisted, her voice raw with a grief that would never fully heal. Not Michael. He loved these woods. Her words, preserved in newsprint, echoed in Elias's mind, a constant refrain against the unsettling silence of the forest. What had happened between 8:19 a.m. and the moment his absence became undeniable? The answer lay buried, if it lay at all, beneath layers of earth, time, and human conjecture. The forest, ancient and unforgiving, offered no easy answers. His boot nudged something hard, partially buried in the moss and decaying leaves. It wasn't metal nor stone, it was smooth, almost impossibly so given its environment. He knelt, carefully brushing away the detritus. A small, amber-colored glass bottle, no bigger than his thumb, emerged from its earthen tomb. It was old, no doubt, but remarkably intact. The glass, though dulled by years of exposure, still held a faint sheen. He turned it over in his gloved hand. The label, though faded and peeling at the edges, was still legible enough to reveal a name, O'Connell, and beneath it a prescription for hydrochlorothiazide, a common diuretic. The date on the label was May 1994. A cold jolt, a sudden electric current coursed through Elias. This was it. Not the boot, not the unsubstantiated rumor, but something undeniably, viscerally connected to the vanished ranger. This small bottle, a mundane item of daily life, had been hidden in plain sight, a silent witness for 15 years. It lay precisely where he had been searching, a macabre reward for his obsessive quest. The discovery was less a moment of triumph and more one of profound melancholy. It was evidence, yes, but evidence that amplified the mystery rather than resolving it. Why here? Why this? And what did it mean for the overall narrative of Michael O'Connell's impossible disappearance? The bottle felt impossibly light in his hand, yet it carried the weight of years, of unanswered questions, of a family's enduring pain. He carefully placed it in a forensic evidence bag, the clear plastic a sterile barrier between the past and the present. He took a series of photographs documenting the exact location, the surrounding vegetation, the angle at which it lay. Each click of the camera's shutter was a timestamp, a point of no return in the unfolding narrative. The metadata from these images would form the bedrock of his own meticulous investigation. The discovery shifted the entire paradigm. Before, O'Connell's disappearance was an enigma without a focal point, a void. Now there was a physical object, a tangible link to the man himself, and by extension to the moment he ceased to exist. The bottle, a vessel for a common medication, became a chalice of sorrow, a relic of a life abruptly curtailed. It confirmed he had been here, in this precise spot, around the time of his vanishing. But it did not explain how he had vanished, or why. The irony of the situation was acute. A man who dedicated his life to preventing emergencies in the wild had become an emergency himself, his own medicine bottle a silent testament to his preparedness, yet utterly useless in the face of whatever force took him. The forest kept its secrets, but sometimes it left a breadcrumb, a cruel hint to remind us of its power. Back in his small, meticulously organized study, Elias began to dissect the implications of the bottle, the hydrochlorothiazide, a routine prescription indicating a common manageable condition. It wasn't something that would lead to sudden incapacitation or disorientation. This wasn't a case of a ranger collapsing from an unforeseen medical event. The medication was a piece of O'Connell's life, a fragment of his routine, now severed from its owner. It spoke of normalcy, of a future he expected to have. The bottle was clean on the inside, no residue, no remaining pills. This suggested it had been emptied. But why here? Why discard it in such an isolated location, miles from any clear trail? If O'Connell had been experiencing a medical emergency, wouldn't he have sought help, or at least left a clearer sign? The act of discarding the bottle rather than carrying it back suggested a deliberate action, or perhaps an action under duress. This single item, a common pharmaceutical container, began to warp the accepted narrative of a simple tragic disappearance. It introduced an element of the deliberate, of the conscious, even if that consciousness was ultimately overwhelmed. The investigation for Elias had truly begun. He pored over old records, microfiche copies of news reports, even dusty copies of the official search and rescue logs. The initial reports detailed exhaustive grid searches, canine units deployed across hundreds of acres, thermal imaging flights conducted at dawn and dusk. The focus had been on finding O'Connell, or at least his remains. The assumption was a fall, an animal attack, or perhaps succumbing to the elements. But none of these theories adequately explained the complete lack of any trace. No torn clothing, no disturbed earth, no blood, no struggle. The forest floor, even after years, retains certain markers. A fall leaves a mark. A struggle leaves a mark. O'Connell, a man of considerable experience, would not have simply vanished. He carried a radio, a whistle, a flare gun. Yet no distress signal was ever received. The evidence log from his Bronco was chilling in its ordinariness. A half-eaten granola bar, a well-worn copy of Walden, a logbook with entries up to the morning of May 14th, a simple silver wedding band in the console. The man was prepared for a day in the woods, not for an encounter with the inexplicable. The bottle now offered a new lens, a new vector of inquiry. What if the event wasn't a sudden, catastrophic accident, but something else entirely? Imagine you are standing on that summit on May 14, 1994, the sun warm on your face, the air smelling of pine and damp earth. You check your watch. 8:19 a.m. You confirm your location, a routine radio check-in. The day stretches ahead, predictable, serene. You are Michael O'Connell, a steward of this vast, untamed wilderness. You know its moods, its dangers, its rhythms. You are equipped, skilled, and utterly at home. Then something shifts. The silence deepens, or perhaps a new sound emerges, a sound that shouldn't be there. You reach for your bottle of medication, perhaps feeling a slight tremor, a sudden, inexplicable unease. You empty the last pill, perhaps in a moment of ritual, a tiny act of control in an environment that is suddenly, subtly hostile. And then the void. No struggle, no cry for help, just the absolute terrifying absence. The forest, a silent sentinel, watches but offers no explanation. The bottle, a forgotten sentinel, remains. The mountains don't explain why. They never do. They simply hold what they are given, and sometimes, after years, they release a small, insignificant truth that only deepens the mystery of the loss. This is the cruel irony of the wild. It nurtures life, but it also consumes it, leaving behind only echoes and fragments for those who dare to listen and to search. The moral warning is clear. Even the most prepared among us are but temporary guests in the grand, indifferent theater of nature. The search for Michael O'Connell did not end with the official suspension of operations in June 1994. It merely moved into the shadowed halls of memory and the obsessive notebooks of those left behind. Among these was the grieving investigator, in this case a retired state trooper named Arthur Penhaligon, who had been part of the initial grid search and had never quite managed to look at the Allegheny the same way again. For Arthur, the woods were no longer a recreational space. They were a vast, unindexed filing cabinet containing a single missing document. He maintained a map in his basement, a forensic reconstruction of the 1994 search parameters, layered with GPS drift data and historical weather patterns. The discovery of the medicine bottle by Elias Thorne in 2009 acted as a catalyst, pulling Arthur back into the obsessive rhythm of the timeline. He looked at the coordinates of the discovery: 41.6782 degrees north, 79.0124 degrees west. It was a location that defied logic. This area had been cleared by a line of 40 men on May 18, 1994. They had walked arm to arm, their boots churning the very soil where the bottle was eventually found. How does a bright amber object escape the eyes of 40 trained professionals, only to surface 15 years later on top of the moss? The mountains keep their secrets, but they also play with the chronology of evidence. Arthur's journals from that period reflect a man struggling to ground the impossible in the mundane. At 10:15 a.m., we reached the hemlock stand. One entry reads, "Visibility was 10 yards. The ground was soft, receptive to footprints. We found nothing, not a broken twig. It's as if he walked into a different layer of reality." This was the central frustration of the O'Connell case, the lack of ground disturbance. In forensic storytelling, we look for the signature of a struggle, the scuff of a boot, the broken branch of a mountain laurel, the indentation of a body. Michael O'Connell left none of these. He was a man of 190 pounds carrying 20 pounds of gear. Physics dictates that he should have left a trail. Yet the forensic image of the site in 1994 was a blank canvas. The discovery of the bottle suggested that the evidence wasn't missing, it was waiting. It was a delayed transmission from a lost man. Arthur began to theorize about environmental shifting, the idea that the forest floor is a slow-moving river of organic matter that can swallow and regurgitate objects over decades. But even that didn't explain the bottle's position. It sat atop the leaf litter, not beneath it. It looked as though it had been placed there yesterday. The reconstruction of the narrative truth required a deeper dive into O'Connell's final hours. On May 14, 1994, the barometric pressure had dropped sharply between 9 a.m. and 11 a.m. A localized weather event, a microburst of wind and rain, had lashed the eastern sector. Investigators in 1994 had dismissed this as a minor inconvenience, but Arthur revisited the metadata of the forest's reaction. High-velocity winds in old-growth hemlocks can create widowmakers, heavy dead branches that fall without warning. Had Michael been struck? If so, where was the body? A man pinned by a limb doesn't vanish. He becomes part of the landscape's architecture. Arthur's eyes scanned the macro shots of the bottle Elias had provided. He noticed something the amateur hadn't, a tiny microscopic scratch pattern on the base of the glass, consistent with high-frequency vibration. This wasn't the wear and tear of wind or water. It was the signature of something mechanical. Imagine you are Michael O'Connell, 9:30 a.m. The wind begins to howl through the hemlocks, a sound like a distant freight train. You aren't afraid. You've heard this 1,000 times. But today the frequency is different. The air feels heavy, ionized. You reach for your medicine, a reflex action to a sudden crushing headache. You aren't just a ranger anymore. You are a biological sensor reacting to an atmospheric anomaly. You drop the bottle. You don't pick it up. Why? Because the ground you are standing on is no longer the ground you recognize. The open-loop question haunts the file. If he was injured, why no blood? If he was lost, why no whistle? The expert victim's greatest strength is his ability to signal his location. O'Connell's silence was a choice or a forced state. Arthur's investigation turned toward the thermal footprint of the area. In 1994, the FLUR, forward-looking infrared technology, was primitive compared to the 2020s, but the archival footage remained. Arthur spent weeks staring at the grainy, static-filled tapes of the May 15th overflights. At the 14-minute mark, over the sector where the bottle was found, there is a flare, a momentary saturation of the thermal sensor. At the time, it was dismissed as a solar glint off a rock, but Arthur, using modern digital enhancement, saw a shape. It was a heat signature that shouldn't exist in a damp forest. A perfect 98.6-degree humanoid form standing perfectly still in the center of a thicket. It lasted for 3 frames, then it blinked out. No movement into the trees, no gradual dissipation of heat, just an abrupt exit from the thermal spectrum. The rule of irony suggests that Michael's meticulous nature was his undoing. He followed the leave-no-trace ethics of the Forestry Service to a hauntingly literal conclusion. He left no trace of his life, his struggle, or his death, save for that one amber bottle. The evidence log from the 2009 discovery site added more items to the tally. Near the bottle, Elias had missed a small fragment of olive-drab nylon caught in the bark of a tree 6 feet above the ground. It was a piece of a ranger's shoulder patch. The forensic analysis of the nylon showed molecular shearing, a type of damage caused by extreme localized tension, the kind found in jet engine intakes or high-altitude depressurization. The mountains don't explain why a piece of a man's uniform is torn upward 6 feet into the air in a forest where the highest predator is a black bear. As Arthur grew older, his obsession shifted from the what to the where. He began to look at GPS drift reports from hikers in that specific sector. Between 1994 and 2009, over 30 separate hikers reported that their compasses spun or their GPS units placed them miles away from their actual location. This was the void, a geographic glitch where the standard laws of navigation surrendered. Michael O'Connell, the master navigator, had walked directly into the heart of a dead zone. The grieving investigator realized that Michael hadn't been lost in the woods. He had been lost in the physics of the woods. The bottle wasn't a clue to his location, it was a marker of the border. The reconstruction continued with a focus on the expert victim's psychology. O'Connell was known for his stay-put philosophy. He taught children that if they were lost, they should hug a tree and wait. He wouldn't have run. He wouldn't have panicked. He would have sat down, checked his watch, and waited for the world to find him. The fact that he was never found implies that he wasn't in the world anymore. The bottle sitting on the moss 15 years later was a message from the other side of that stay-put promise. It was as if he was saying, I am still exactly where I stopped. The forensic casual tone of the official reports could never capture the melancholic reality of Sarah O'Connell's life. She kept his dinner plate in the warming oven for 3 years. She refused to sign the presumed dead paperwork until 2001. When Elias brought her the bottle in 2009, she didn't cry. She simply held it to her cheek and whispered, "He's still cold." How does a wife know the temperature of a soul? The mountains keep their secrets, but the heart has its own sonar. The discovery didn't bring closure, it brought a renewal of the open loop. If the bottle returned, would the man follow? Or was the bottle the only part of him the forest was willing to parley? Arthur Penhaligon sat in his basement, the 2009 photos spread across his desk. He looked at the macro shot of the moss. There, barely visible in the high-resolution forensic image, was a depression in the greenery next to the bottle. It was the shape of a hand, not a hand reaching out for help, but a hand rested in a position of calm, meditative repose. Michael O'Connell hadn't died in terror. He had sat down, taken his medicine, and waited for a rescue that was happening in a dimension he could no longer touch. The irony was a jagged pill. His perfect adherence to survival protocol had made him invisible to the very people using those same protocols to find him. No signal, no trace. Just the crushing weight of a tragedy that refused to age. Why would he stay so still? Why would he let the forest grow around him? The reconstruction points to a narrative truth more terrifying than a simple accident. Michael O'Connell didn't vanish, he was archived. The transition from discovery to forensic reconstruction requires a cold clinical eye, and in the case of Michael O'Connell, that eye belonged to Dr. Elias Thorne, a specialist in delayed trace evidence who joined the investigation in late 2010. By this time, the amber medicine bottle had been moved to a controlled environment, a sterile lab where the mundane was elevated to the status of a holy relic. The reconstruction, the narrative truth phase, began not with a search of the woods, but with a search of the object itself. Dr. Thorne used a technique known as vacuum metal deposition to look for latent fingerprints on the glass, a process that can reveal oil residues even after decades of exposure to the elements. What he found was a fragmented emphasis of a life interrupted. There were no full prints, only the pressure signatures of a grip that was unnaturally tight. The markings indicated that at some point O'Connell was holding the bottle with enough force to nearly shatter the glass. This wasn't the grip of a man taking a routine pill. It was the grip of a man anchoring himself to a physical object. The irony of the expert victim is that their tools often become their only legacy. The bottle, designed to hold life-sustaining chemistry, had become a ballast. At 1:14 p.m. on the day of the forensic review, the metadata from the bottle's cap revealed another anomaly. Under a scanning electron microscope, the threads of the plastic cap showed signs of thermal fusion. Small patches of the polymer had melted and resolidified in a pattern that suggested a brief, intense burst of electromagnetic energy. This echoed the flare seen in the 1994 thermal footage. We are forced to ask, what environmental factor in the Allegheny National Forest can generate enough heat to melt plastic while leaving the surrounding moss and the man's hand unburned? The forensic casual explanation would point to a rare atmospheric phenomenon, perhaps a bolt from the blue lightning strike that bypassed the trees. But the trees were untouched. There were no scorch marks on the hemlocks, no charred earth, just a melted cap and a man who was no longer there. The open-loop question shifted from where he went to what he encountered. The grieving investigator, Arthur Penhaligon, remained obsessed with the 15-year gap. He began to study the dendrochronology, the tree ring history of the hemlocks surrounding the discovery site. He discovered that in the year 1994, the trees in that specific 50-yard radius had experienced a growth stunt. Their rings for that year were microscopically thin, as if the forest itself had held its breath. For one season, the biological clock of the woods had slowed to a crawl. This led Arthur to a haunting hypothesis, the time-dilated void. If O'Connell had entered a pocket of space where time moved differently, his 8:19 a.m. check-in might have been his last moment in our reality, while for him the struggle lasted only seconds. To the forest, he was a momentary guest. To the world, he was a 15-year ghost. The mountains keep their secrets, but they also keep their own time. Imagine you are standing in that clearing now, the forensic team buzzing around you like insects. You see the yellow tape, the numbered markers, the macro lenses capturing the texture of the rust on a nearby abandoned logging chain. You realize that the expert victim didn't make a mistake. Michael O'Connell did everything right. He stayed near his vehicle initially. He maintained his equipment. He kept his medication on his person. But preparedness is a human construct, a shield of paper against a storm of iron. His strength, his reliance on protocol, became a trap. He stayed put because the manual told him to stay put, even as the world around him began to warp. He was a prisoner of his own excellence. The evidence log now included a secondary discovery made by Arthur during a follow-up sweep. A silver whistle found wedged deep inside the hollow of a rotted log 20 feet from the bottle. It was clogged with silt, but when cleaned, it still worked. Its pee was stuck, frozen by a decade of moisture. A whistle that couldn't scream for a man who couldn't be seen. The reconstruction then turned to the biological metadata. In 2011, a soil analysis of the discovery site revealed an organic spike in nitrogen, consistent with the decomposition of a large mammal, but the DNA was inconclusive. It was degraded beyond the threshold of sequencing, a phrase that acting as a forensic euphemism for gone. The forest had digested the evidence of Michael O'Connell, leaving only the inorganic, the nylon, the silver, the glass. This is the rule of irony in its purest form. The man who loved the forest was literally integrated into it. He became the nitrogen in the soil, the carbon in the hemlocks. He was no longer a person, he was a coordinate. The narrative truth was that there was no body to find because the body had become the location. The pacing of the investigation slowed as the leads dried up once more. The slow burn of the cold case returned. Arthur Penhaligon would sit in his truck at the trailhead, watching the sunset over the Allegheny, wondering if the thermal flare he saw on the old tapes was Michael looking back at the helicopter, unable to wave, unable to shout, separated by a thin, shimmering veil of physics we don't yet understand. He thought about the expert victim and the grieving investigator as two sides of the same coin, both obsessed with order in a world defined by chaos. The forest is not a place of malice, it is a place of indifference. It doesn't care about your rank, your training, or your prescription. It only cares about the cycle. By 2013, the case was once again moved to the inactive file, but the amber bottle remained on a shelf in the county evidence locker, a small, glowing reminder of the impossible discovery. Why did the bottle surface in 2009? Why not 1995 or 2020? Some theorists suggested that the 15-year mark was significant, a harmonic resonance of the original event. Others, more somber, believed the forest was simply finished with it. The items were being returned like library books, one by one, long after the borrower was gone. The moral warning is etched into the very glass of that bottle. Our presence in the wild is a temporary loan, and the interest is paid in silence. Arthur's final journal entry before his own passing in 2015 was a single declarative sentence. The mountains don't explain why, they only show you what you've lost. He had spent 20 years looking for a man and found only a landscape. He realized that Michael O'Connell hadn't disappeared in 1994. He had been translated. The bottle was the last word in a sentence that ended in a period of moss and stone. The open loop remains, a haunting vibration in the air of the Allegheny. If you walk those trails today near the old-growth hemlocks, you might feel a sudden drop in pressure. You might reach for something to hold on to. No signal, no trace. Just the wind through the needles, whispering a name that the earth has already forgotten. The final phase of the reconstruction began with the digital archaeology of Michael O'Connell's last known movements, a process that utilized 2024-era LiDAR, light detection and ranging, mapping to peer beneath the canopy. The technology revealed what the human eye and the 1994 search teams could not: a ghost trail of depressions in the earth, invisible from the surface but stark in the topographical data. These were not footprints, but a series of perfectly circular compression zones that led from the ranger's vehicle to the clearing where the bottle was found. They didn't follow the path of a man walking. They followed a line of absolute mathematical precision, cutting through briars and rock faces as if the obstacles didn't exist. This was the forensic image of an impossible transit. The experts analyzed the depth of these compressions. They indicated a weight 4 times that of a human. Something had moved through the forest that morning, or rather, something had moved Michael through the forest. At 3:44 p.m. on the anniversary of the disappearance, a team of researchers returned to the coordinates. They weren't looking for bodies anymore. They were looking for magnetic remnants. In the soil directly beneath where the amber bottle had rested, the magnetic field of the earth was permanently twisted. It was a geographic glitch that had persisted for decades. This explains the GPS drift and the spinning compasses that Arthur Penhaligon had documented. Michael O'Connell hadn't stepped into a hole, he had stepped into a transient fold. The forest, in its vast ancient complexity, occasionally produces localized anomalies where the standard laws of Newtonian physics simply fail. The expert victim, with all his training and his silver whistle, was trying to navigate a landscape that was no longer three-dimensional. The irony is staggering. He was an expert in a world that had for a few hours ceased to be his. The evidence log of the mind is where the most haunting details reside. Sarah O'Connell, in her final years, spoke of a dream that recurred every May 14th. In it, Michael wasn't calling for help. He was explaining the forest to her. "He told me the trees weren't trees," she once said to an investigator. "He said they were the ribs of something much larger, and he was just a speck of dust in its lungs." This was the narrative truth that the official reports could never include, the psychological impact of a disappearance that defies the rational. The grieving investigator acts as the proxy for this existential dread. We obsess over the medicine bottle because we need it to be a clue. We need it to lead to a conclusion. But in the Allegheny, the clue is the conclusion. The bottle returned because it was inorganic, a foreign body rejected by the forest's slow biological immune system. Michael, being organic, was absorbed. Imagine you are standing in that clearing now, the LiDAR data projected onto a screen in front of you. You see the red dots of the compression zones ending abruptly at the moss. You realize that the impossible discovery of 2009 wasn't a miracle. It was a scheduled release. The forest had finished its analysis of the man. It kept the memories, the DNA, the spirit, and it gave back the trash, the plastic, the glass, the nylon. This is the ultimate moral warning of the Michael O'Connell case. We believe our tools and our preparedness make us masters of the wilderness, but we are merely permitted guests. When the forest decides to close the door, no radio signal can pierce the wood. No expert can find the exit. The open loop of his life didn't close with the finding of his medicine, it merely widened to include us all. The final forensic report on the bottle noted one last detail: a microscopic layer of pollen fossilization on the interior of the glass. The pollen was from a species of tree that hasn't existed in the Allegheny for 10,000 years. The bottle hadn't just been sitting on the moss for 15 years. It had been somewhere else, or somewhere when. The mountains keep their secrets, but they also keep their history, layered like the rings of a hemlock. Michael O'Connell had walked into a deeper layer of time, and when he dropped his medicine, he dropped it across a chasm we are only beginning to name. The reconstruction ends here, at the edge of the known. The rule of irony concludes with the ranger's own logbook. The final entry, written at 8:05 a.m. on May 14, 1994, was a note about the weather. Quiet morning. The woods feel settled today, no surprises expected. He was right, in a way. For the forest, there was no surprise. There was only the continuation of a cycle that has been turning since long before humans named the mountains. The slow burn of the mystery doesn't end with a body or a confession. It ends with the realization that we are surrounded by shadows we cannot map. The grieving investigator eventually stops looking at the maps and starts looking at the trees, searching for a face that has become a leaf, a voice that has become the wind. Justice through memory is all that remains. We remember Michael O'Connell not as a victim, but as a pioneer who crossed a border he didn't know was there. The amber bottle, now housed in a small museum near the forest edge, catches the light of the setting sun every afternoon. For a moment it glows with an inner fire, a small synthetic sun in a room full of shadows. It is a reminder that even in the vast, indifferent silence of the wild, the mundane can become a monument. No signal, no trace, just the bottle, just the silence. The mountains don't explain why, they simply remain. As the sun sets over the Allegheny, the text overlays of our investigation fade to black. The metadata of a life is archived. The expert victim is at rest in the soil he swore to protect. The grieving investigator has joined him in the long silence. And the forest? The forest is already preparing for the next morning, the next routine patrol, the next traveler who thinks they are prepared for the impossible. Beware the silence between the heartbeats of the woods. It is there in that quiet that the secrets are kept.